practical understanding of the way that money and credit work. Several told me that understanding money and credit in this way has been the biggest missing piece in their quest to understand the lessons of history, and I explained to them that their perspectives helped me understand the political dynamics that are ECT policy choices. This chapter is focused on the money, credit, and economic piece. Let's start with money and credit. The timeless and universal fundamentals of money and credit. People, companies, nonprofit organizations, and deal with the same basic financial realities, and always have. They have money that comes in and money that goes out that, when netted, make up their net income. These OUs are measured in numbers that appear in income statements. If an entity brings in more than it spends, it has a pro-T that causes its savings to go up. If it spends more than it earns, its savings go down, or it makes up the D rents by borrowing or taking money from someone else. If an entity has many more assets than liabilities, it can spend above its income by selling assets until the money runs out, at which point it has to slash its expenses. If it doesn't have much more in assets than it has in liabilities and its income falls beneath the amount it needs to pay out to cover the total of its operating expenses and its debt service expenses, it will have to cut its expenses or will default or restructure its debts. All of an entity's assets and liabilities can be shown in its balance sheet. Whether it writes those numbers down or not, every country, company, non-profit organization, and individual has them. When economists, for example, combine each entity's income, expenses, and savings, they get all entities' incomes, expenses, and savings. The way entities collectively handle their finances as in their income statements and balance sheets is the biggest driver of changes in internal and world orders. If you can take your understanding of your own income, expenses, and savings, imagine how that applies to others, and put them together, you will see how the whole thing works. Take a moment to think about your own financial situation. How much income do you have now relative to your expenses and how much will you have in the future? How much savings do you have and what are those savings invested in? Now play things out. If your income fell or disappeared, how long would your savings last? How much risk do you have in the value of your investments and savings? If that value fell by half, how would you be Nancy Ally? Can you easily sell your assets to get cash to pay your expenses or service your debts? What are your other sources of money, from the government or from elsewhere? These are the most important calculations you can make to ensure your economic well-being. Now look at others, other people, businesses, non-profit organizations, and governments, realizing that the same is true for them. See how we are interconnected and what changes and conditions might mean for you and others who might ECT you. Since the economy is the sum of these entities operating in this way, it will help you understand what is happening and what is likely to happen. For example, since one entity's spending is another's income, when one entity cuts its expenses, that will hurt not just that entity, but it will also hurt others who depend on that spending to earn income. Similarly, since one entity's debts are another's assets, an entity that defaults reduces other entities' assets, which requires them to cut their spending. This dynamic produces a self-reinforcing downward debt, an economic contraction that becomes a political issue as people argue over how to divide the shrunken pie. As a principle, debt eats equity. What I mean by that is that debts have to be paid above all else. For example, if you own a house and you can't make the mortgage payments, the house will be sold or taken away. In other words, the creditor will get paid ahead of the owner of the house. As a result, when your income is less than your expenses and your assets are less than your liabilities, you are on the way to having to sell your assets. Unlike what most people intuitively think, there isn't a XCD amount of money and credit in existence. Money and credit can easily be created by central banks. People, companies, non-profit organizations, and governments like it when central banks make a lot of money and credit because it gives them more spending power. When the money and credit are spent, it makes most goods, services, and investment assets go up in price. It also creates debt that has to be repaid, which requires people, companies, non-profit organizations, and governments to eventually spend less than they earn, which is difficult and painful. That is why money, credit, debt, and economic activity are inherently cyclical. In the credit creation phase, demand for goods, services, and investment assets and the production of them are both strong, and in the debt repayment phase, both are weak. But what if the debts never had to be paid back? Then there would be no debt squeeze and no painful paying back period. But that would be terrible for those who lent because they'd lose their money, right? Let's think for a moment to see if we can envy a way of resolving debt issues without harming either borrowers or lenders. Since governments have the ability to both make and borrow money, why couldn't the central bank lend money at an interest rate of about 0% to the central government to distribute as it likes to support the economy? Couldn't it also lend to others at low rates and allow those debtors to never pay it back? Normally, debtors have to pay back the original amount borrowed plus interest in installments over a period of time. But the central bank has the power to set the interest rate at 0% and keep rolling over the debt so that the debtor never has to pay it back. That would be the equivalent of giving the debtors the money, but it wouldn't look that way because the debt would still be accounted for as an asset that the central bank owns, so the central bank could still say it is performing its normal lending functions. This is the exact thing that happened in the wake of the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many versions of this have happened many times in history. Who pays? It is bad for those outside the central bank who still hold the debts as assets, cash and bonds, who won't give returns that would preserve their purchasing power. The biggest problem that we now collectively face is that for many people, companies, non-profit organizations, and governments, their incomes are low in relation to their expenses, and their debts and other liabilities are very large relative to the value of their assets. It may not seem that way. In fact, it often seems the opposite, because there are many people, companies, non-profit organizations, and governments that look rich even while they are in the process of going broke. They look rich because they spend a lot, have plenty of assets, and even have plenty of cash. However, if you look carefully, you will be able to identify those that look rich but are in financial trouble because they have incomes that are below their expenses and or liabilities that are greater than their assets. So if you project what will likely happen to their finances in the future, you will see that they will have to cut their expenses and sell their assets in painful ways that will leave them broke. We each need to do those projections of what the future will look like for our own finances, for others who are relevant to us, and for the world economy. In a nutshell, for some people, companies, non-profit organizations, and countries, the liabilities are enormous relative to the net incomes and the asset values that are required to meet those obligations, so they are financially weak. But they don't look that way because they spend a lot by borrowing. If anything I've written here is confusing to you, I urge you to take a moment to try to apply it to your own circumstances. Pencil out what your financial safety margin looks like. Then do that calculation for others, add them up, and then you will have a good picture of the state of your world. I've done that with the help of my partners at Bridgewater, and find it invaluable in imagining what is likely to happen. In summary, these basic financial realities work for all people, companies, non-profit organizations, and governments in the same way they work for you and me, with the one big, important exception I mentioned earlier. All countries can create money and credit out of the air to give to people to spend or lend out. By producing money and giving it to debtors in need, central banks can prevent the debt crisis dynamic that I just explained. For that reason, I will modify the prior principle to say, debt eats equity, but central banks can feed debt by printing money instead. It should be no surprise that governments print money when debt crises cause politically unacceptable amounts of equity-eating debt and corresponding economic pain. However, not all money that governments print is of equal value. The monies that are widely accepted around the world are called reserve currencies. At the time of my writing this, the world's dominant reserve currency is the US dollar, which is created by the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. A much less important reserve currency is the euro, which is produced by the Eurozone country's central bank, the European Central Bank. The Japanese yen, the Chinese renminbi, and the British pound are relatively small reserve currencies now, though the renminbi is quickly growing in importance. Having a reserve currency is great, while it lasts because it gives a country exceptional borrowing and spending power and significant power over who else in the world gets the loan credit needed to buy and sell internationally. However, having a reserve currency typically sows the seeds of a country ceasing to be a reserve currency country. That is because it allows the country to borrow more than it could otherwise afford to borrow, and the creation of lots of money and credit to service the debt debases the value of the currency and causes the loss of its status as a reserve currency. The loss of its reserve currency status is a terrible thing because having a reserve is one of the greatest powers a country can have because it gives the country enormous buying power and geopolitical power. In contrast, non-reserve currency countries often envy themselves in need of money in a reserve currency when they have a lot of debt denominated in that currency, which they can't print, or they don't have much savings in that currency, and their ability to earn the currency they need falls. When countries desperately need reserve currencies to service their reserve currency-denominated debts, and to buy things from sellers who only accept reserve currencies, they can go bankrupt. This has happened often in the past, and it is where things now stand for a number of countries. It is also where things stand for local governments and states and for many of us. This configuration of circumstances has been handled in the same way, so it's easy to see how this machine works, and that is what I will show you in this chapter. Let's start with the basics and build from there. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange that can also be used as a storehold of wealth. By medium of exchange, I mean something that can be given to others to buy things. Basically, people produce things in order to exchange them with people who have other things they want. Because carrying around non-money objects in the hope of exchanging them for what one wants is inscient, virtually every society that has ever existed has created a form of money, which is something portable that everyone agrees is of value so it can be exchanged for what they want. By a storehold of wealth, I mean a vehicle for storing buying power between acquiring it and spending it. While one of the most logical things to store wealth in is a claim on money that can be used later, people also store their wealth in assets that they expect will retain their value or appreciate, such as gold, silver, gems, paintings, real estate, stocks, and bonds. By holding on to something that appreciates, they know that they can do a bit better than just holding on to the currency, and when needed, can always exchange the thing they're holding to get the currency to buy the things they want to buy. This is where credit and debt come into the picture. It is important to understand the difference between money and debt. Money is what settles claims, you pay your bills and are done. Debt is a promise to deliver money. When lenders lend, for example, they assume the money plus the interest they receive back will buy more goods and services than if they had simply held on to the money. When all goes well, the borrowers use the money productively and earn a profit with it themselves, so they can pay the lenders back and still have money left over. While the loan is outstanding, it is an asset for the lender and a liability for the borrower. When the money is paid back, the assets and liabilities disappear, and both the borrower and lender are better off, having essentially split the proceeds that came from the productive lending. Such lending is also good for society, which benefits from the resulting productivity gains. It's important to realize that most money and credit have no intrinsic value. They are just journal entries in an accounting system that can easily be changed. The purpose of that system is to help allocate resources efficiently so that productivity can grow, rewarding both lenders and borrowers, but the system periodically breaks down. When that happens, the currency supply is monetized, and currency values fall or are destroyed, and wealth shifts in a big way, sending shockwaves through the economy and markets. What all this means is that the debt and credit machine doesn't work perfectly. Supplies, demands, and values of money cycle up and down. The upswings produce joyful abundance. The downswings produce painful restructurings. Let's now get into how these cycles work, building from the fundamentals up to where we are now. Money, credit, and wealth. While money and credit are associated with wealth, they aren't the same thing as wealth. Because money and credit can buy wealth, the amount of money and credit you have and the amount of wealth you have look pretty much the same. But you cannot create more wealth simply by creating more money and credit. To create more wealth, you have to be more productive. The relationship between the creation of money and credit and the creation of wealth is often confused, yet it is the biggest driver of economic cycles. Let's look at it more closely. There is typically a mutually reinforcing relationship between the creation of money and credit and the creation of goods, services, and investment assets that are produced, which is why they're often confused as being the same thing. Think of it this way: there is both a natural economy and a real economy. Though they are related, they are different. Each has its own supply and demand factors that drive it. In the real economy, supply and demand are driven by the amount of goods and services produced and the number of buyers who want them. When the level of goods and services demanded is strong and rising and there is not enough capacity to produce the things demanded, the real economy's capacity to grow is limited. If demand keeps rising faster than the capacity to produce, prices go up and inflation rises. That's where the natural economy comes in. Facing inflation, central banks normally tighten money and credit to slow demand in the real economy. When there is too little demand, they do the opposite by providing money and credit to stimulate demand. By raising and lowering supplies of money and credit, central banks are able to raise and lower the demand and production of natural assets, goods, and services. But they're unable to do this perfectly, so we have the short-term debt cycle, which we experience as alternating periods of growth and recession. Then of course there is the value of money and credit to consider, which is based on its own supply and demand. When a lot of a currency is created relative to the demand for it, it declines in value. Where the money and credit are is important to determining what happens. For example, when they no longer go into lending that fuels increases in economic demand and instead go into other currencies and in Asian hedge assets, they fail to stimulate economic activity and instead cause the value of the currency to decline and the value of an Asian hedge assets to rise. At such times, high inflation can occur because the supply of money and credit has increased relative to the demand for it, which we call monetary inflation. That can happen at the same time as there is weak demand for goods and services and the selling of assets, so that the real economy is experiencing deflation. That is how inflationary depressions come about. For these reasons we have to watch movements in the supplies and demands of both the real economy and the natural economy to understand what is likely to happen financially and economically. For example, how natural assets are produced by the government through fiscal and monetary policy has a huge effect on who gets the buying power that goes along with them, which also determines what the buying power is spent on. Normally money and credit are created by central banks and now into natural assets, which the private credit system uses to finance people's borrowing and spending. But in moments of crisis, governments can choose where to direct money, credit, and buying power rather than it being allocated by the marketplace, and capitalism as we know it is suspended. This is what happened worldwide in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Related to this confusion between the natural economy and the real economy is the relationship between the prices of things and the value of things. Because they tend to go together, they can be confused as being the same thing. They tend to go together because when people have more money and credit, they are more inclined to spend more and can spend more. To the extent that spending increases economic production and raises the prices of goods, services, and natural assets, it can be said to increase wealth because the people who already own those assets become richer, when measured by the way we account for wealth. However, that increase in wealth is more an illusion than a reality for two reasons. One, the increased credit that pushes prices and production up has to be paid back, which, all things being equal, will have the opposite effect when the bill comes due. And two, the intrinsic value of a thing doesn't increase just because its price goes up. Think about it this way: if you own a house and the government creates a lot of money and credit, there might be many eager buyers who would push the price of your house up. But it's still the same house. Your actual wealth hasn't increased, just your calculated wealth. It's the same with any other investment asset you own that goes up in price when the government creates money, stocks, bonds, etc. The amount of calculated wealth goes up, but the amount of actual wealth hasn't gone up because you own the exact same thing you did before it was considered to be worth more. In other words, using the market values of what one owns to measure one's wealth gives an illusion of changes in wealth that don't really exist. As far as understanding how the economic machine works, the important thing to understand is that money and credit are stimulative when they're given out and depressing when they have to be paid back. That's what normally makes money, credit, and economic growth so cyclical. The central bankers who control money and credit vary the costs and availability of money and credit to control markets and the economy. When the economy is growing too quickly and they want to slow it down, central bankers make less money and credit available, causing both to become more expensive. This encourages people to lend rather than borrow and spend. When there is too little growth and central bankers want to stimulate the economy, they make money and credit cheap and plentiful, which encourages people to borrow and invest and/or spend. These variations in the cost and availability of money and credit also cause the prices and quantities of goods, services, and investment assets to rise and fall. But banks can only control the economy within their capacities to produce money and credit growth, and their capacities to do that are limited. Think of the central bank as having a bottle of stimulant it can inject into the economy as needed. When the markets and the economy sag, it delivers shots of the money and credit stimulant to pick them up. When the markets and economy are too strong, it gives them less or no stimulant. These moves lead to cyclical rises and declines in the amounts and prices of money and credit, and of goods, services, and financial assets. These moves typically come in the form of short-term debt cycles and long-term debt cycles. The short-term debt cycles of ups and downs typically last about 8 years, give or take a few. The timing is determined by how long it takes the stimulant to raise demand to the point that it reaches the limits of the real economy's capacity to produce. Most people have seen enough of these short-term debt cycles, popularly known as the business cycle, to know what they are like, to such an extent that they mistakenly think they will go on working this way forever. I distinguish them from the long-term debt cycle, which typically plays out over 50 to 75 years. Because the crises that occur as these long-term debt cycles play out happen only once in a lifetime, most people don't expect them. As a result, they typically take people by surprise and do a lot of harm. The long-term debt cycle that is now in the late cycle phase was designed in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and began in 1945, when World War II ended and the dollar-US-dominated world order began. These long-term debt cycles are driven by the amount of stimulant left in the central bank's bottle. They start after previously existing excess debts have been restructured and central banks have a full bottle of stimulant. They end when debts are high and the bottle of stimulant is nearly empty or, more specifically, when the central bank loses its ability to produce money and credit growth that passes through the economic system to produce real economic growth. Throughout history, central governments and central banks have created money and credit, which weaken their own currencies and raise their levels of monetary ination to offset the deflation that comes from deflationary credit and economic contractions. This typically happens when debt levels are high, interest rates can't be adequately lowered, and the creation of money and credit increases financial asset prices more than it increases actual economic activity. At such times, those who are holding the debt typically want to exchange the debt they are holding for other storeholds of wealth. Once it is widely perceived that money and debt assets are no longer good storeholds of wealth, the long-term debt cycle is at its end, and a restructuring of the monetary system has to occur. Since these cycles are big deals and have happened virtually everywhere for all of recorded history, we need to understand them and have timeless and universal principles for dealing with them well. But most people, including many economists, don't even acknowledge their existence. That's because to get a sample size of observations that is large and diverse enough to give one a good understanding, one has to have studied them over many hundreds of years in many different countries. In Part 2 we will do just that, examining the most important of these cycles across history and around the world, with reference to the timeless and universal mechanics of why money and credit work and fail to work as mediums of exchange and storeholds of wealth. In this chapter, I will synthesize all those cases so I can show you how they work archetypically. I will begin with the basics of the long-term debt cycle from way back when and bring you up to the present, giving you the classic template. To be clear, I'm not saying that all cases transpire exactly like this one, but I am saying that they almost all follow this pattern closely. The long-term debt cycle. The long-term debt cycle transpires in 6 stages. Stage 1. It begins with A, little or no debt, and B, money being hard. The debt burdens from the last cycle were largely wiped out by restructuring and debt monetization, and because of the consequences of these, particularly in Asian. There is a return to hard money like gold and silver, or sometimes a link to a hard currency. For example, after the destruction of debt and money in Germany's Weimar Republic, money became backed by gold-denominated assets and land and pegged to the dollar, and after its destruction in Argentina in the late 1980s, money became linked to the dollar. At this stage, money being hard is important because no trust or credit is required to carry out an exchange. Any transaction can be settled on the spot, even if the buyer and seller are strangers or enemies. There is an old saying that gold is the only financial asset that isn't someone else's liability. When you receive gold coins from a buyer, you can melt them down and exchange the metal and still receive almost the same value as if you had spent them, unlike a dead asset like paper money, which is a promise to deliver value, which isn't much of a promise, given how easy it is to print. When countries are at war and there is no trust in their intentions or abilities to pay, they can still pay in gold. So gold can be used as both a safe medium of exchange and a safe storehold of wealth. Stage 2. Then come claims on hard money. Because carrying a lot of metal money around is risky and inconvenient, and creating credit is attractive to both lenders and borrowers, credible parties arise that put the hard money in a safe place and issue paper claims on it. These parties came to be known as banks, though they initially included all sorts of institutions that people trusted, such as temples in China. Soon people treat these paper claims on money as if they are money itself. After all, they can be redeemed for tangible money or used to buy things directly. This type of currency system is called a linked currency system, because the value of the currency is linked to the value of something, typically hard money, such as gold and silver. Stage 3. Then comes increased debt. At RST there are the same number of claims on the hard money as there is hard money in the bank. Then the holders of paper claims and the banks discover the wonders of credit and debt. Holders of paper claims loan them to banks in exchange for interest payments. The banks like to do that because they can lend the money to others who can pay a higher interest rate, allowing the banks to make a profit. Those who borrow from the bank like it because it gives them buying power they didn't previously have. And the whole society likes it because it leads asset prices and production to rise. Since everyone is happy with how things are going, they do a lot of it. More lending and borrowing happens over and over again many times, there is a boom, and the quantity of the claims on the money rises relative to the amount of actual goods and services there are to buy. Eventually the claims become much larger than the actual hard money in the bank. Trouble approaches when there isn't enough income to service one's debts, or when the amount of claims people are holding in the expectation that they can sell them to get money to buy goods and services increases faster than the amount of goods and services by an amount that makes the conversion from that debt asset impossible. These two problems tend to come together. Concerning the RST of these problems, think of debt as negative earnings and a negative asset that eats up earnings and eats up other assets. It is senior, meaning it gets paid before any other type of asset, so when incomes and the values of assets fall, there is a need to cut expenditures and sell assets to raise the needed cash. When that's not enough, there needs to be a debt restructurings and or b, the central bank printing money paired with the central government handing out money and credit to LL in the holes in incomes and balance sheets. Stage 4, then debt crises, defaults, and devaluations come, which leads to the printing of money and the breaking of the link to hard money. As for the second problem, this happens when holders of debt don't believe they are going to get adequate returns from it relative to other storeholds of wealth and the costs of goods and services. Debt assets are held by investors who believe they are storeholds of wealth that can be sold to get money, which can be used to buy things. When holders of debt assets try to make the conversion to real money and real goods and services and end out that they can't, a run occurs, by which I mean that lots of holders of that debt try to make the conversion to money, goods, services, and other financial assets. The bank, regardless of whether it is a private bank or a central bank, is then faced with the choice of allowing that of money out of the debt asset, which will raise interest rates and cause the debt and economic problems to worsen, or of printing money. in the form of issuing bonds and buying enough of the bonds to prevent interest rates from rising and hopefully reverse the run out of them. Inevitably, the central bank breaks the link, prints the money, and devalues it because not doing that causes an intolerable deflationary depression. The key at this stage is to create enough money and devaluation to offset the deflationary depression, but not so much as to produce an inflationary spiral. When this is done well, I call it a beautiful deleveraging, which I describe more completely in my book Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. Sometimes that buying works temporarily. However, if the ratio of claims on money to the amount of hard money there is and the quantity of goods and services there is to buy are too high, the bank is in a bind that it can't get out of. It simply doesn't have enough hard money to meet the claims. When that happens to a central bank, it has the choice either to default or to break the link to the hard money, print the money, and devalue it. Inevitably, the central bank devalues. When these debt restructurings and currency devaluations are too big, they lead to the breakdown and possible destruction of the monetary system. The more debt there is, the more it will be necessary to devalue the money. Remember, there is always a limited amount of goods and services because the amount is constrained by the economy's ability to produce. Also remember that, as shown in our example of paper money being claims on hard money, there is a limited amount of that hard money, while the amount of paper money and debt is constantly growing. As the amount of paper money claims grows relative to the amount of hard money in the bank and goods and services in the economy, the risk increases that the holders of those debt assets may not be able to redeem them for the amounts of hard money or goods and services that they expect to receive for them. A bank that can't deliver enough hard money to meet the claims being made on it is in trouble, whether it is a private bank or a central bank. Those central banks have more options than private banks. That's because a private bank can't print the money or change the laws to make it easier to pay their debts, while some central banks can. Private banks must either default or get bailed out by the government when they get into trouble, while central banks can devalue their claims if their debts are denominated in their national currency. If the debt is denominated in a currency that they can't print, then they too must ultimately default. Stage 5 then comes at money, which eventually leads to the debasement of money. Central banks want to stretch the money and credit cycle to make it last for as long as it can because that is so much better than the alternative. So when the system of hard money and claims on hard money becomes too painfully constrictive, governments typically abandon it in favor of what is called at money. No hard money is involved in at systems. There is just paper money that the central bank can print without restriction. As a result, there is no risk that the central bank will have its stash of hard money drawn down and have to default on its promises to deliver it. Rather, the risk is that, freed from the constraints on the supply of tangible gold, silver, or some other hard asset, the people who control the printing presses will create ever more money and debt assets and liabilities in relation to the amount of goods and services being produced until the time comes when those holding the enormous amount of debt will try to turn it in for goods and services, which will have the same EECT as a run on a bank and result in either debt defaults or the devaluation of money. The shift from a system in which the debt notes are convertible to a tangible asset at a XED rate to a monetary system in which there is no such convertibility last happened in the U.S. on the evening of August 15, 1971. As I mentioned earlier, I was watching on TV when President Nixon told the world that the dollar would no longer be tied to gold. I thought there would be pandemonium with stocks falling. Instead, they rose. Because I had never seen a devaluation before, I didn't understand how it works. In the years leading up to 1971, the U.S. government had spent a lot of money on military and social programs, then referred to as guns and butter policy, that it paid for by borrowing money, which created debt. The debt was a claim on money that could be exchanged for gold. Investors treated this debt as an asset because they got paid interest on it, and because the U.S. government promised that it would allow the holders of those notes to exchange them for the gold that was held in U.S. vaults. As the spending and budget deficits grew, the U.S. had to issue much more debt, i.e., create many more claims on gold, even though the amount of gold in the bank didn't increase. Investors who were astute enough to notice could see that the amount of outstanding claims on gold was much larger than the amount of gold in the bank. They realized that if this continued, the U.S. would have to default, so they turned in their claims. Of course, the idea that the US government, the richest and most powerful government in the world, would default on its promise to give gold to those who had claims on it seemed implausible at the time. So, while most people were surprised by Nixon's announcement and the EX on the markets, those who understood the mechanics of how money and credit work were not. When credit cycles reach their limit, it is the logical and classic response for central governments and their central banks to create a lot of debt and print money that will be spent on goods, services, and investment assets in order to keep the economy moving. That was done during the 2008 debt crisis, when interest rates could no longer be lowered because they had already hit 0%. It also happened in a big way in 2020 in response to the plunge triggered by the COVID pandemic. That was also done in response to the 1929-32 debt crisis, when interest rates had similarly been driven to 0% at the time I am writing this. The creation of debt and money has been happening in amounts greater than at any time since World War II. To be clear, printing money and giving it out for spending rather than supporting spending with debt growth is not without its benefits. Money spends like credit, but in practice it doesn't have to be paid back. There is nothing wrong with having an increase in money growth instead of an increase in credit debt growth, if the money is put to productive use. The risk is that it will not be. If money is printed too aggressively, and it is not used productively, people will stop using it as a storehold of wealth and shift their wealth into other things. History has shown that we shouldn't rely on governments to protect us financially. On the contrary, we should expect most governments to abuse their privileged positions as the creators and users of money and credit for the same reasons that you might commit those abuses if you were in their shoes. That is because no one policymaker owns the whole cycle. Each comes in at one or another part of it, and does what is in their interest to do given their circumstances at the time and what they believe is best. Since early in the debt cycle governments are considered trustworthy, and they need and want money as much as or more than anyone else does, they are typically the biggest borrowers. Later in the cycle, new government leaders and new central bankers have to face the challenge of paying back debts with less stimulant in the bottle. To make matters worse, governments also have to bail out debtors whose failures would hurt the system, the too big to fail syndrome. As a result, they tend to get themselves into cash-out jams that are much larger than those of individuals, companies, and most other entities. In virtually every case, the government contributes to the accumulation of debt with its actions and by becoming a large debtor itself. When the debt bubble bursts, the government bails itself and others out by buying assets and or printing money and devaluing it. The larger the debt crisis, the more that is true. While undesirable, it is understandable why this happens. Money and credit and pass them out to everyone to make them happy, it is very resist the temptation to do so. It is a classic financial move. Throughout history, rulers have run up debts that won't come due until long after their own reigns are over, leaving it to their successors to pay the bill. Printing money and buying financial assets holds interest rates down, which stimulates borrowing and buying. Those investors holding bonds are encouraged to sell them. The low interest rates also encourage investors, businesses, and individuals to borrow and invest in higher returning assets, getting what they want through monthly payments they can afford. This leads central banks to print more money and buy more bonds and sometimes other financial assets. That typically does a good job of pushing up financial asset prices but is relatively inscient at getting money, credit, and buying power into the hands of those who need them most. That is what happened in 2008 and what happened for most of the time until the 2020 coronavirus-induced crisis. When money printing and purchasing of financial assets fail to get money and credit to where they need to go, the central government borrows money from the central bank so the government can spend it on what it needs to be spent on. The Fed announced that plan on April 9, 2020. That approach of printing money to buy debt is vastly more politically palatable as a way of shifting wealth from those who have it to those who need it than imposing taxes because those who are taxed get angry. That is why central banks always end up printing money and devaluing. When governments print a lot of money and buy a lot of debt, they cheapen both, which essentially taxes those who own it, making it easier for debtors and borrowers. When this happens to the point that the holders of money and debt assets realize what is going on, they seek to sell their debt assets and or borrow money to get into debt they can pay back with cheap money. They also often move their wealth into better storeholds, such as gold and certain types of stocks, or to another country not having these problems. At such times, central banks have typically continued to print money and buy debt directly or indirectly while outlawing the flow of money into an Asian hedge assets, alternative currencies, and alternative places. Such periods of re-Asian either stimulate a new money and credit expansion that enhances another economic expansion or devalue the money so that it produces monetary ination. Earlier in the long-term debt cycle, when the amount of outstanding debt isn't large and there is a lot of room to stimulate by lowering interest rates, there is a strong likelihood that credit growth and economic growth will be good. Later in the long-term debt cycle, when the amount of debt is large and there isn't much room to stimulate, there is a much greater likelihood of monetary ination accompanied by economic weakness. While people tend to believe that a currency is pretty much a permanent thing and that cash is the safest asset to hold, that's not true. All currencies devalue or die, and when they do, cash and bonds are devalued or wiped out. That is because printing a lot of currency and devaluing debt is the most expedient way of reducing or wiping out debt burdens. When debt burdens are sufficiently reduced or eliminated, the credit debt expansion cycles can begin again, as described in the next chapter. As I explained comprehensively in my book Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises, there are 4 levers that policymakers can pull to bring debt and debt service levels down relative to the income and cash out levels required to service debts. 1. Austerity. 2. Debt defaults and restructurings. 3. Transfers of money and credit from those who have more than they need to those who have less than they need. 4. Printing money and devaluing it. These levers typically progress from one to another for logical reasons. Austerity is deflationary and doesn't last long because it's too painful. Debt defaults and restructurings are also deflationary and painful because the debts that are wiped out or reduced in value are someone's assets. As a result, defaults and restructurings are painful for both the debtor who goes broke and has their assets taken away and for the creditor who loses wealth when the debt is written down. Transfers of money and credit from those who have more than they need to those who have less than they need is politically challenging but more tolerable than the RST 2 ways and is typically part of the resolution. Compared to the others, well understood, and most common big way of restructuring debts, in fact, it seems good rather than bad to most people because it helps to relieve debt squeezes. It's tough to identify any harmed parties that the wealth was taken away from to provide this natural wealth. In most cases it causes assets to go up in the depreciating currency that people measure their wealth in, so it appears that people are getting richer. This is what has been happening during the coronavirus crisis as central governments and banks send out large amounts of money and credit. Note that you don't hear anyone complaining about the money and credit creation. In fact, people say that governments would be cheap and cruel if they didn't provide a lot more of it. Hardly anyone acknowledges that governments don't actually have this money to give out. Governments aren't rich entities with piles of money lying around. They are just their people collectively, who will ultimately have to pay for the creation and giving out of money. Now imagine what those same citizens would say if government officials cut expenses to balance their budgets and asked them to do the same, making lots of them go broke, and or if they sought to redistribute wealth from those who have more to those who have less by raising taxes. The money and credit producing path is much more acceptable politically than either of those options. It's as if you change the rules of monopoly to allow the banker to make more money and redistribute it whenever too many players are going broke and getting angry. Stage 6. Then the eye back into hard money. When taken too far, the overprinting of that currency leads to the selling of debt assets and the earlier described bank run dynamic, which ultimately reduces the value of money and credit, which prompts people to eat out of both the currency and the debt. History teaches us that people typically turn to gold, silver, stocks that maintain their real value, and currencies and assets in other countries not having these problems. Some people think that there has to be an alternative reserve currency to go to for this to happen, but that's not true, as the same dynamic of the breakdown of the monetary system and the running to other assets has happened in cases in which there was no alternative currency. There are a lot of things people run to when money is devalued, including rocks in Germany's Weimar Republic. The debasement of the currency leads people to run from it, and from debt denominated in it, and into something else. At this stage of the debt cycle, there is typically economic stress caused by large wealth and values gaps. These gaps lead to higher taxes and guiding between the rich and the poor. This also makes those with wealth want to move to hard assets, other currencies, and other countries. Naturally, those who are governing the countries that are erring from this hide from their debt, their currency, and their country want to stop it. So governments make it harder to invest in assets like gold, foreign currencies, and foreign countries. Eventually the debt is largely wiped out, usually by making the money to pay it back plentiful and cheap, which devalues both the money and the debt. When the devaluations and defaults become so extreme that the money and credit system breaks down, necessity generally compels governments to go back to some form of hard currency to rebuild people's faith in the value of money as a storehold of wealth. Quite often, though not always, the government links its money to gold or a hard reserve currency with a promise to allow holders of that new money to convert it to the hard money. Sometimes that hard money is in other countries. For example, over the past decades, many weak currency countries have linked their money to the US dollar or simply dollarized their economy. To review, holding debt as an asset that provides interest is typically rewarding early in the long-term debt cycle when there isn't a lot of debt outstanding, but holding debt late in the cycle, when there is a lot of debt outstanding and it is closer to being defaulted on or devalued, is risky relative to the interest rate being given. So, holding debt is a bit like holding a ticking time bomb that rewards you while it is still ticking and blows you up when it stops. And as we've seen, that big blow up happens something